Welcome back to the Retailer series. We're still in the heart of Milan, meeting with Jacopo Corvo, third generation of the family who created GMT as great masters of times. He's going to tell us everything about what happened in the last 50 years.
Ele!
Ciao!
Ciao, how are you?
Good, and you?
Good, thanks. Welcome to Milan.
Thank you. Where are we?
So this is the courtyard of our HQ. We have our offices up there and our after-sale atelier down there.
Okay.
We are here since about 10 years, but the story starts much earlier, almost 70 years ago.
I want to know everything about
Of course, come with me.
So 70 years of stories. What happened in the 50s when it all started?
My grandfather, Giorgio Corvo, was working for a distribution agency that was doing the distribution for the Italian market of Audemars Piguet, Vacheron Constantin, Jaeger-LeCoultre. And he was taking care of the three main regions, so the north of Italy, Piedmont, Lombardia, and Veneto. Then in 1957, they asked him which brand he wanted to have when he was opening his own company for the whole market. And he chose Jaeger because it was the only real manufacturer and it was producing movements and parts for the other two brands. So that's how the dream starts. My father started to take care of Jaeger for the whole Italian market, and he started to develop the brand.
And at the time, Jaeger was not that popular in Italy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, none of these three brands were super popular in Italy. Watchmaking was completely different. I mean, 50% of the Jaeger business in Italy were Atmos. So it's completely different from today.
And then, I mean, the 60s was more of a consolidation period where nothing major happened. But the 70s was a very interesting and rich period for the watch industry, but especially with the implication of your grandfather.
The 60s were years of consolidation and development, always in a smaller scale compared to today, of course. But then something major happened, not only for Italy, but for the whole Swiss watchmaking, so the quartz crisis. The Japanese invented the quartz.
Early 70s?
Late 60s, but it started early 70s. It was much more precise, much cheaper, so watch brands were blowing up day by day. And during those years, so in 1972, my grandfather discovers 200 cases in the Jaeger-LeCoultre manufacture, rectangular cases that were turning. And he inquires about this watch, and they say that they are not producing it since 40 years, except a few examples. But they said, nah, leave it, you know? But he fought for one entire year, and he asked them to give them whatever they had, so he could case a watch, a reverso watch, here in Milan, and show them that the reverso could have been revamped.
And there was some interest, and it was at the same year that, as an anecdote, the AP Jaeger-LeCoultre launches the first YLO.
Absolutely.
Nobody liked it.
Nobody liked it. Yeah, but even the reverso, it took years to...
Yeah, of course.
But it took 1 year for my grandfather to convince Jaeger to put it again in production. So he brings the cases in Milan, the dials that he found, there were 200 dials, 100 white, 100 gray. He brings the dials in Milan, and he cased one of the ovetto movements. So it was an oval movement. It was not the same as the movements used in the 30s for the reverso. So after that, he brings back the watch, and they're like, okay, we don't want to know anything. We just give you all the parts. You can case whatever you want, etc., etc. Just do it. In those years, so quartz crisis, hardcore. He was selling more or less 200 Jaeger-LeCoultre for the whole Italian market. So he produced 200 reverso, which were sold in 1 month only in the city of Milan. So he did a turnover of 1 year in a month.
So he went back to Jaeger, like, I need more.
Exactly. He went back to Jaeger saying, guys, now you need to do something. So it took a while because they had to redesign and re-engineer the whole case and the whole rotating system, which was, of course, for the first 200 pieces was very old. I mean, it was still the project of the 30s. But then after a few years, they relaunched the reverso.
And so what happened then? Like the milestone in between he decides and he pushes Jaeger-LeCoultre to actually get into the whole reverso, and the moment that I actually go for it and it becomes something global.
Well, it became something global a little bit later.
But your grandfather still had the priority because he was at the verge of the beginning of the story.
Absolutely.
That is so cool.
He's always been involved in the creation of the new collections, of course.
I'm sure your grandfather kept a few reverso at the time. Did he pass it along from your father to you?
I have one of those original 200 reversos that he gifted to my father, and my father gifted it to me when I was 18 years old.
That is so nice.
For my birthday.
Mattia must be a little jealous.
He has other reversos, don't worry.
So the 80s was a very big fashion period and the watches were kind of growing, but 1990s was a big milestone for your family.
So the 80s are years of consolidation and a little bit of growth for the Swiss watch industry, and people start to get in love again with Swiss mechanical watches. And
Quartz is behind. Not behind, but they learn to live with it.
But yeah, exactly. I mean, there are the years of Swatch, there are the years of the relaunch of Breguet, etc., etc. So what happens is that they are the introduction to the renaissance of Swiss watchmaking, which are the 90s. And especially with the Reverso, we see the first limited editions, the first complications, and the Corvo company and the Italian market becomes the first market in the world for Jaeger-LeCoultre.
And at the time, your father has joined your grandfather in the company, and there's still a distribution company with one brand, Jaeger-LeCoultre.
Absolutely. So my father starts end of the 70s, and in the 90s he takes, his role grows in the company, and he becomes also part of the production management team of Jaeger-LeCoultre. Because, at that time, distributors were involved. They were so important.
In the creation of pieces. Absolutely. And to get a temperature of what was the market was requesting and what they wanted.
I imagine that American markets, Middle East, Asia, that they were not as strong as today. So Italy, France, and Germany, they were the first 3 markets in the world for Swiss watchmaking.
Crazy.
Still in the 90s and early 2000s. So
not too long ago when you think about it.
No, it's not. It's crazy. It's crazy. Before the Russians started to purchase watches, there was Europe, the
Middle East, and all these. Thanks to the digital era, a lot of things changed.
Correct. A lot of things changed. And in the 90s, my grandfather passes away, and my father Michele keeps on consolidating the brand on the Italian market. So we're still the first market in the world for Jaeger. And then Richemont acquires Jaeger-LeCoultre in 2000, and this leads to the closing of our contract with Jaeger-LeCoultre in 2003.
Because if we put the dates and the facts right, Jaeger at this time was still an independent company where you participated as a retailer, which is also often the story when we talk about independent watchmakers or independent brands. It's thanks to the work of retailers and distributors that the brand all of a sudden becomes a brand.
Absolutely. Imagine that even the relaunch of Lange in the mid of the 90s was done firstly in Italy.
Okay.
So, those were real great years. The renaissance of Swiss watchmaking were the 90s.
And as we talked about it in the previous episode, the Italian market, when it comes to watch collecting, was very important because it would set the trend as a cultural philosophy of what could be liked throughout the world.
It was still the years of what works in Italy works everywhere else. We were trendsetters back then.
We still are.
Yeah, not as important as before, but still.
No, but if we go back to also the big story of what the Reverso and Jaeger-LeCoultre was, it was what we call une montre de forme. It was not round, so it had a rectangular case. You could flip it. It was already, the story goes back to Polo Player, where the watch was created for it not to be damaged when they would be playing polo. So there's a whole story behind it.
If you think about it, it's probably one of the first sport watches in history, even though it was not waterproof, of course.
And was your grandfather and father polo players?
No, they never played polo.
And yet they loved the watch.
Oh, absolutely.
2000, new millenary, but also big turning point in your history and the history of Jaeger, because the brand is acquired by the Richemont Group.
Absolutely.
What happens then?
Then what happens? So there are a few back and forth because apparently Richemont wants to acquire the Corvo company to make it become the Italian subsidiary.
Okay.
But in the end, they don't find an agreement, and my father wants to stay to keep his independency.
Of course.
And the dream fades. So the contract is broken in 2003, and that's when he starts to work with François-Paul Journe, with Harry Winston, with Urwerk, with Chanel, with Porsche Design, always in the distribution part. So we don't have a store yet. That happens a few years later. So in 2007, we open our first GMT boutique.
So wait a second. In 2007, you become retailers and distributors.
Correct.
But also when you become a full-on distributor, you go and pick only independent brands. And at the time, Jaeger was an independent brand on its own, but then you decided to go with all these brands who at the time were very niche, because Chanel was starting their watch department. Had just started maybe 10 years before, 1993, their watch department. And then you've got all these things. Do you know, I mean, you were a kid back then, but you were still part of the Corvo story of what happened in the watchmaking in Italy. But why did he choose these brands?
Because he loves watchmaking, and he already wanted to work with François-Paul since they first met in 1999, but he couldn't because he had a non-competitive agreement with Jaeger. So as soon as he could, he invited François-Paul in Milan. They shake hands in our previous office, and it starts our history with François-Paul. It's 20 years now.
So, Jacopo, thank you for those insights. I mean, 70 years of history, sum it up in about 10 to 15 minutes. So, guys, if you have to remember 4 names, you've got Giorgio, Michele, Jacopo, and Mattia, which is now a 3-generation family story of the retail industry here, specifically in Milan, because that's where the HQ is. Now we led up to the next episode, which will be everything about independent watchmaking and how GMT has been vouching for those indies very early on.